Top accolade global news updates. I am Soybifa Jackarich. Sonkichi Sakihara recalls chancing upon some of the last refugees to arrive on Yonaguni, 4 men who had sailed more than 2,000 kilometers from Vietnam to reach Japan's westernmost inhabited island. It was 1977. Today, some residents of Yonaguni foresee another refugee crisis that they say their isolated outpost and its dwindling population of less than 1,700 would be ill-equipped to handle. Just 101 kilometers to the west and occasionally visible from Yonaguni is Taiwan. The self-ruled island of 24 million than China assets is its territory and which Beijing is menacing with stimulated missile strikes and other displays of military firepower. Concerned about the potential for conflict, Japan has embarked on its biggest defense build-up since World War II, but the $2,900 billion outlay comes without a parallel plan to prepare Yonaguni for a possible humanitarian crisis that residents like Sakihara say would quickly overwhelm their chores. Some U.S. officials say China may be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. Chinese leader Xi Jinping told U.S. President Joe Biden last month that no such plan exists, but he's raising pressure on Taiwan ahead of a January 13th presidential election that Vice President Lai Ching-te, who Beijing views as a separatist, is tipped to win. Taiwan's foreign ministry declined to address questions about whether it had discussed humanitarian contingencies with Japan, but said Taipei would not act rashly or succumb to Chinese coercion. British Home Secretary James Cleverly arrived in Rwanda on Tuesday to sign a new treaty to send asylum seekers to the African nation after the UK's top court declared the deportation scheme unlawful. The Rwanda plan is at the center of the government's strategy to cut migration and is being watched closely by other countries considering similar policies. But the United Kingdom's Supreme Court last month ruled that such a move would violate international human rights laws enshrined in domestic legislation. Since that ruling, Britain has been seeking to renegotiate its agreement with Rwanda to include a binding treaty that it would not expel asylum seekers sent there by Britain. One of the court's major concerns, Cleverly, who arrived in Rwanda's capital Kigali on Tuesday morning, is due to meet with the country's foreign minister, Vincent Biruta, to sign the agreement. Under the plan, Britain intends to send thousands of asylum seekers who arrived on its shores without permission to Rwanda to deter migrants crossing the channel from Europe in small boats. In return, Rwanda has received an initial payment of £140 million, that is $180 million, with the promise of more money to fund the accommodation and care of any deported individuals. China on Tuesday issued safety guidelines for the use of autonomous vehicles in public transport, the latest in a series of measures preparing for the increased use of driverless cars. The guidelines apply to autonomous vehicles for passengers including taxis, as well as for freight, the Ministry of Transport said in a statement. The guidelines cover vehicles of various degrees of automation and mandate they carry at least one driver or security inspector. They also require companies using autonomous vehicles for public transport to be qualified and licensed, and states that companies can work together with automakers on such operations. The world's largest auto market has been mapping out standards and regulations for autonomous driving. It aims to formulate a system that will support assisted and autonomous driving functions by 2025 and introduce standards that will support the development of autonomous driving applications and establish a safety assurance system by 2030. China said last month it will allow road trials of intelligent connected vehicles. In October, it issued guidelines for highway engineering facilities to support autonomous driving technology, and in July, it issued guidelines on the standardization of intelligent connected vehicles. Israeli forces pressed ahead with their air and ground bombardment of southern Gaza Strip, killing and wounding dozens of Palestinians, even as the United States and the United Nations repeatedly urged them to protect civilians. Residents and journalists on the ground said the intense Israel airstrikes in the south of the densely populated coastal enclave included areas where Israel had told people to seek shelter. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres appealed to Israel to avoid further action that would make the already dire humanitarian situation in Hamas run Gaza worse, and to spare civilians from more suffering. Israel largely captured the northern half of Gaza in November, and since a week-long truce collapsed on Friday, they have swiftly pushed deep into the southern half. Ali Islamic Jihad's armed wing said its fighters engaged in fierce clashes with Israeli soldiers north and east of Khan Yunis, Gaza's main southern city. Israeli tanks have driven into Gaza across the border and cut off the main north-south routes, residents said. The Israeli military said the central road of Khan Yunis to the north constitutes a battlefield and was now shut. Israel on Tuesday said 3 of its soldiers had died in combat in Gaza on Monday, in what Army radio described as a day of fierce battles with Hamas fighters. 78 soldiers have died in Gaza since the start of military ground invasion. The Director General of the World Health Organization, WHO, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, reiterated calls for Israel to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure building hospitals. When temperature climbed north of 40 degrees Celsius, that is 104 degrees Fahrenheit in Seville during the summer's crushing heat wave in Europe, air conditioning use jumped 23% in the South Spanish city compared to how many hours ACs ran during the same period in 2022. While cooling technologies can save lives during deadly heat, they also threaten to worsen the climate crisis. The energy used in cooling and refrigerant accounts for about 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and demand could more than triple by 2050, according to the International Energy Agency. At this year's UN Climate Summit, governments and companies are grappling with the problem by discussing energy efficiency and reining in high pollution refrigerants. Dozens of countries are backing a COP28 pledge to reduce cooling related emissions by at least 68% by 2050 from 2022 levels. But industry experts say governments need to offer incentives for companies to bring sustainable AC technologies to market and scale up. Even making today's most efficient units more affordable could help. That is the size of top accolade global news updates. You can follow us on our social media platforms as displayed on your screen. Happy Tuesday.